Now, it's very well said, all truth is parallel. If you can find truth in the natural, it's also true in the spiritual. If it's true in the spiritual, it's true in the natural. All truth is parallel. And that's the way that life begins. Just one single cell is the way that life begins. Then the single cell begins to multiply itself. All life grows this way, by cell multiplication. And so this is the way that we came into being. It's the way we were created. We started as a single cell that continued multiplying. And as the cells multiply, they become a baby in the mother's womb. It becomes a baby. And then, of course, the result of that is the miraculous new life. A baby is born, and there really is no greater miracle in this natural world than a new baby. That new life, the same is true spiritually. There is no greater miracle than someone that is born of God, that's born again, that experiences the life of God. So as I said, a small group is a small group. It will always act like a small group. We're a small group here today. We've done that intentionally because we want this to be a discipling time, and this is everybody's welcome to watch, but not everybody's welcome to be in this room. We can't do that, and keep it a small group atmosphere. So a small group is a small group. It doesn't matter what you call them. As I said, I believe every church has them, but they're not organized. They're not functioning properly. For instance, a small group is a small group if you call it a Sunday school class. A small group is a small group if you call it a choir or a musical group, a worship team, a prayer ministry, a ladies ministry, men ministry. It doesn't matter what you call it. If it's a small group, it's going to function like a small group. Now, if you remember the study that I gave you on Jesus multiplying the loaves and fishes, you saw clearly in that story the importance of the large group, and the importance of the small group. And so we have them. It's our responsibility as spiritual leaders to organize them properly, to see that they're functioning, and to make sure that they are doing what they're created to do. So there's different kinds of small groups, and there's different types of small group structures. What we're trying to emphasize in this lesson is the type of structure is not as important as the purpose. If it's created for evangelism, for instance, outreach, if it's created to multiply, if it's not, then we're not talking about the same thing here, because we're talking about small groups which multiply. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is the small groups. They are actually the building blocks for church life. Right. And this is the way that we need to learn to think of them. It's just like your body is made up of many different organs. These organs, like the heart, the brain, the lungs, the liver, they all have the same DNA, but yet all of these organs function for certain purposes. They have a distinctive purpose. Well, this is what we need to do in creating small groups in the church, is make sure that they are functioning properly for the health of the body, but then also for the growth of the body. Now, I want to emphasize this very strongly. We're not talking about another church program here. We're not talking about small groups as a supplement to what we're doing. We're talking about the very life, the essence of why we're doing what we're doing, the way that we're going to accomplish it. See, it's in the small group where we learn how to be disciples of Jesus Christ. The multitudes never did learn that. And it's one of the mistakes I have made as a teacher is trying to disciple the multitudes. You can't do that. You can only disciple a small group. It's the only way it can be done. And that's why Jesus chose 12, that they might be with him and that he might teach them, send them out to preach. He was multiplying himself through the small group. And so it's the purpose behind it to multiply itself. This is where we learn how to become disciples of Jesus Christ. Or we could say it's in the small group where we learn how to live as Christians. I remember, I tell you, when you're involved in ministry, one of the things that is scary for me to think about standing before God is all the bad counsel I have given to people, But I'm thankful when I get one right. And I'm thinking about, this goes back over 20 years ago now. 20 years ago in Chiapas, Mexico, the number one rock and roll band got converted. And I'm saying that literally. These guys, they were good musicians, and they were extremely talented. And they were drawing crowds of thousands of teenagers. Out of a band of 5, 3 of them got saved and become followers of Jesus. But they were just heathen. They knew nothing about serving God. They knew nothing about Christianity, about their Bible. And so, I met them. And of course, they're celebrities. These guys were the rock and roll, the number one band in the whole state. And so I sat them down and talked to them. I said, now please listen to me. I said, what you need to do right now is get in a local church and be discipled to learn how to live the Christian life. I said, you are so popular and you're so talented. Everybody will want you to come and sing at their events and such because just your name, they would call the Angels of Fire, just your name will draw a lot of people. And pastors love to draw people when they're having some special event. And so they will be inviting you. I said, there's going to be plenty of time for that. You don't know how to live the Christian life. You don't understand your Bible. You don't know how are you going to be a Christian? You need to get into a church and get discipled. I introduced them to the Foundation Truth material, and thankfully they at least listened to me in part because they still, I thought, traveled too much, but they did get in a local church, got discipled. Today, out of that band, there's like 3 of them that are now pastors of huge churches. That would not have happened if they had not have been discipled. So it's in the small group where we learn how to live the Christian life. Now, in looking at the survey that they did with the Natural Church Development, this was one that really shocked me at first. And I have to admit, I struggled with this, but I've come to believe these pastors are right. Almost 1/3 of the pastors of the high quality growing churches, almost 1/3 of them said they would prefer, if a person had to choose, for them to go to a small group than to come to the church services. Mm-hmm. Boy, now, I confess, that one set me back, and I had to think about and pray about and meditate about that a lot. Sure. And so when you look at the graph, the way they did it, they asked this question, would you prefer, if a person had to choose between church attendance or a small group, which would you prefer? It was 29% of the high-quality growing churches, and you can see you still got 70%, that they're still battling with that. But 30% of them said, yes, I would prefer them to go to a small group than to attend the church services. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the dying churches, only 6%, almost none of them, said that they would. In other words, even though the church is dying, You know that the church service is not going to be that inspiring, but only 6% said we would prefer them go to a small group than to come to the church services. Now, I don't know about you, and it's something we probably want to discuss, but I'm convinced they're right. If you've got it designed right and it's functioning as it ought to function. If it's not, of course, then you don't need to attend anything. It's not functioning. Okay, the third thing I want to talk about is small groups are where our personal needs are met. Now, this is one of the biggest weaknesses when it comes to preaching. We have to assume too much.
Right.
And because we're not Jesus, we don't always get it right. Have you ever thought somebody was thinking one thing only to discover they weren't thinking about that at all? You know, that wasn't their problem. They were not thinking what you thought they were thinking. And when you're preaching, you have to assume you know what the needs are in their life, and you're trying to answer their questions and trying to help them. In small groups, you get to know them. Now, I think it was Andy Stanley that put out some material concerning this, and he talked about the three different areas of a church. He said the first thing is the large foyer. You need to have a big front door where everybody is welcome and feels like a guest. Then he said you take them into a smaller room. He called it the living room. In the living room, it's a smaller, more intimate setting. People become friends. But then he said from the living room, you need to take them to the kitchen table, where 3 or 4 people sit around that table and they become family. Now, that's a good way of saying it. That's defining what I'm talking about in small groups. It's in the small group where our personal needs are met. See, just because we become Christians doesn't mean that all of our problems have disappeared, that we found answers to every question in life, that we know what to do and we know what we're doing. No. That's a fantasy. That is not Christianity. See, what this is really, the Christian life is similar to Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he was as alive as he'd ever been alive. But the problem was, he was still wrapped in grave clothes. And that's the way we got to see people that come to Christ. Yes, there is transformation in their life. Their spirit has come alive. And it's a wonderful thing to experience. But just like in the natural, when a new baby is born, if somebody doesn't take care of that baby will die. That baby will never come to maturity. And so our job is what Jesus said about Lazarus. Loose him and let him go. Help get those grave clothes off of him. Start unwinding, because that's the way they would bury them. They would take strips of cloth and they would wrap it around them and around them. And so he's saying, you've got to get the grave clothes off of Lazarus. And that's what we do in the small group. Because there, it's what we scratch them where they itch. You find out what their needs are, and you can speak directly to that need rather than guessing at what's going on in their life. Now, one of the questions that in the survey that they did with Natural Church Development, they said, does your church have a place where people can discuss personal problems? They're not going to do that in a church auditorium. When you get into a large group, people begin clamming up. They begin getting quiet. They don't like to talk. But it's when they become family in a small group around the kitchen table that they can talk about anything that's troubling them, anything that they're trying to find the answer. Here's what they discovered. they discovered that 71% of the high-quality growing churches said yes, we provide that for our people. Among the low-quality, declining churches, those that were dying, only 41% could say yes to that question. I think this gives us a pretty clear picture of why they're dying. Why they're having some of the problems they are is because they're not really meeting the needs of the people. It's in the small group, a small group that's designed for the right purpose, that's functioning properly, where people start talking about things that trouble them. They overcome their fears, because all of us have that. We're afraid people will laugh at us. We're afraid that, they'll reject us. They will, and because of this, we bottle things up inside us. And we don't know the answer. We're trying to find the answer, but that's the reason we keep repeating a lot of the mistakes that we make, is because we think we're doing the right thing, when in reality, we're making a mistake. It's when we finally begin to open up and become honest and overcome our fears, begin to talk about these things. That's only going to happen in the small group setting. It's also in the small group setting where you can reach out and touch people. You can't do that in the auditorium. It's impossible. It's in the small group. We get close to people. We discover what is going on within their life. Now, the fourth thing that I want to talk about, and this is the last area of the small group, is it's in small groups where God has designed reproduction to take place. Boy, I wish I'd have understood that as an evangelist. I could have been much more effective than I was. But I thought that it took place in the larger the crowd, the better I thought it was. Now that's a good place to reach people. That's a good place to make contact. That ought to be your foyer, where you're drawing in a lot of people, but that's not where discipleship takes place. That's not where spiritual growth takes place. Reproduction happens in small groups. So, in designing your small groups, in the formation of it, make sure that the purpose of this small group is to reproduce itself. Now, I need to repeat that, because without that, we're never going to get multiplication of small groups. And I think this is why most groups do not reproduce themselves. They just continue on. I'm not saying they're not doing some good. They are doing good. But good becomes the enemy of the best. It becomes the enemy of doing great things for God. You've got to design the small group to reproduce itself. See, it's not enough for a church to have small groups. The purpose, the basic purpose of the small group should be for multiplication, or I could say evangelization. But we'll talk about that next month. We'll deal with evangelizing and evangelization. But that's what we're talking about here. In multiplication, you're reaching new people. That's the very purpose of the group. Now, here's the danger, and we've all seen it. We've seen churches that become cliques. It becomes, well, that's certain family's church, or a certain preacher's church, or in other words, it doesn't belong to anybody else. They control it. Without the purpose of multiplication for small group, the small group will tend to just become self-centered. And yes, they're having a wonderful time, and they're going to heaven. They're just not taking anybody with them. And tragically, that's what happens to so many Christians. And so it's very important that we build into the DNA of the small group. The purpose of this group is evangelization. Now, let me give you an example from nature here. For instance, look at the trees. The tree doesn't just keep getting bigger. It does that. It keeps growing, but it does something else. The tree also produces fruit that produces seed. And in each one of those seed is the DNA of the tree, so it begins multiplying itself, not through getting bigger, but by growing more trees, more fruit trees. So if the purpose of, for instance, I'm using an illustration of an orange tree here, of the orange tree, the purpose of the orange tree is not just see how big an orange tree it can be or how old an orange tree it can become. No, the purpose of it is to see how much fruit it can produce, because in that fruit is the seed for another orange tree. And someone has well said, anybody with normal intelligence can count the apples on a tree, but only God can count the apple trees in one seed. Well, that is the truth. God is a God of multiplication. And this is the way that we have to think. Think of it. Life is in the seed. And so we are in the business of, let's take somebody to heaven with us. That's the way we're going to change our world, is by multiplication. So this purpose, the basic principle for the small group is the purpose of multiplication. Multiplication. This is what God said in the beginning. When he created mankind, he said, be fruitful and multiply. That is true not only in the natural, it is true in the spiritual. And that is the purpose of our spiritual life. It is also the purpose of our church. Our purpose is to take as many people to heaven as we possibly can. And so one other graph that I will show you here, this is one of the survey questions that was made. Does your church have cells that are designed for cell reproduction? Do you promote cell multiplication? And the statistics were shocking. Of the high quality growing churches, 78%, almost 80% of them said yes. Of the dying churches, those that low quality ministry declining, again, 6% could say yes. That is such a vivid picture, excuse me, a vivid picture of why these churches are dying. When God was creating the creation back in Genesis, the first chapter, one of the statements that he continually made over and over again, 10 times he talks about the life that was in it. It reproduces after its own kind. After its own kind. And everything does that. Horses have baby horses. Cows have baby cows. Ducks have little ducks. Everything reproduces that way. The same is true with Christianity. That's what the Great Commission is all about. The Great Commission is nothing more than the call for multiplication. Take this and preach it everywhere. Preach it to everyone, and everybody that believes will be saved. So that's what the Great Commission is all about. It's a call for multiplication. And it becomes this cycle of life, that the baby becomes the little girl, that becomes the young lady, that becomes the mature woman. It's a cycle. It reproduces itself over and over again. The way that God designed it is through small groups. So I think I've talked long enough. Let's see if we got some interaction. I welcome your questions, your comments. We're so delighted that you're listening to us today.
Well, what a powerful and deep subject. I can't help but to have my mind racing in this season of being in COVID and doing things uniquely different. I can't help but to think now's the time to make some drastic changes in some of our structure. And how to do that, only God can give wisdom.
That's right.
But, you know, this is very eye-opening, especially when you parallel the difference between a dead church and a growing church. Exactly. I believe, I speak for all of us, that this season that we're in, COVID has really exposed those elements.
It has.
In my personal church that I get the honor to pastor, COVID has exposed the casual Christians and the committed Christians.
It does.
And boy, I am just so humbled and grateful for every committed Christian that's able to tune in online, that's able to participate. So I want to turn it over to our pastors. If you have questions or comments regarding this, just let us know, as well as those of you online. If you have a comment or a question about this subject of small groups, we definitely want you to chime in. So, pastors.
Do the small groups always associated to the church and to the pastor still functions over all the small groups? Or do you just let the leaders of some small groups just kind of call it what they want to, set it up as they want to, run it as they want to? How does the pastor manage, I guess is the best way, to a small group?
Very good question, and a very important question. You as a pastor must pastor the leaders that are under you. Learn to think of leadership as layers. You cannot know 100 people intimately. It's impossible. Even Jesus didn't attempt that. He only had 12 disciples in his small group. But you think of those 12 as leaders, that they in turn have their small group that they are over. And so you are discipling the disciplers. So, you know, you do not just turn it over to them and let them, because that's a disaster. It would be like if you had 12 children and you just turn the house over to the kids. Okay, kids, just do whatever you want to do, and we'll be back after a while. Well, you know what you're going to come back to. You're going to have some major problems if the house is still standing, you know. So, no, you don't do that. You have to provide leadership. And so you and whoever the leaders are, you build a leadership team. You develop the plan, the program, just like let the children be children. Don't put all those weights on them. You and your wife, you sit down and you figure out what you're going to do. You act like adults. Don't rob them of their childhood. They will face adult problems soon enough. So let them grow up in a safe atmosphere where there's guidance, there's direction, where there's purpose. In other words, you just don't let a lot of nonsense go on that would end up killing them, destroying them. And the same is true with the church. God has called you as a pastor. We think of pastors just as feeders. That's the number one priority. You're to feed people so they will grow. But you're a leader. A leader. You've got to be taking them. The shepherd didn't just, well, let's say where we want to go today. No. He had already gone and prepared a place for them to come and eat. He had provided good food for them, a good water supply. The same thing is in spiritual. So you as the pastor must pastor them. But don't think you can do it by yourself. As your church grows, the bigger the church grows, the more important the small group becomes. Yeah. Very good question. Thank you.
I want to dive into something that's concerning with something you said regarding making sure small groups are not cliquish.
Right.
I think from my personal experience, when I started pastoring, I looked at the church very corporate because I came from a corporate background, so everything was ran like a corporate setting. And it wasn't until being exposed to your teaching as well as Rick Clendenin, learning that church is a family. And coming from a dysfunctional family, I had to learn a lot of things. And but one of the things that I have learned when it comes to a church family is it becomes very easy to become cliquish.
Oh, yes.
It's
yes.
very easy to develop groups because you've been family for so long, and outsiders have a hard time getting in.
It's true.
And so
Very
one
true.
of the things that I say no to a whole lot in our church is anything that remotely resembles a clique. And cliques are just a negative form of a small group. You know, it's great that people have same interest and enjoy each other's company. We want to foster that. All that to say and ask this question, what are some practical steps that the church, we can do, whether we are a small group leader or a pastor, that can help foster this mindset to evangelize, foster a mindset to reach outside your small group? Because obviously when people get together who like each other's company, that's going to be very natural to not be thinking who to invite and bring in. So what are some practical steps to help a small group really focus on that concept of reaching outside their own group?
Well, you're really getting into next month's lesson. We're going to talk about evangelism in detail. But that's what you've got to be thinking of. You've got to always be looking outside and realizing I'm not what's most important in the family. The most important thing in the family right now are the grandchildren. And the reason they're most important is because soon they're going to be getting married and producing another generation. It's always looking for that next generation that you're going to be raising up. So, again, one of the mistakes I made when I was pastoring, and I say one because I made several, but I really regret this one, and I just missed it. And if I was to do it again now, I would do it totally different than I did. I went in to pastor a church that had gone through terrible trauma. And the pastor that they loved, his two sons were killed in a plane crash. And it was just a traumatic situation. The oldest son was the youth pastor of the church. And he had a strong youth choir. I mean, it was dynamite. You have 110 teenagers on fire for God, you got revival going on, and it was a powerful ministry. Well, they went through all of that. When the plane crash happened, of course, they lost half the young people because they couldn't understand how that God could let somebody that loved God better than they did, somebody they idolized as their leader, to die so young, and it just devastated them. So, but we probably still had about 30 of these young people that had been a part of that original group. They called themselves Generation of Praise, and they were a powerful group. But now they're getting to be 30 years of age, and they're still the youth choir. Well, they're not youth choir anymore. I mean, that's younger than I am, but it's not young. And they didn't want anything to do with these teenage kids. And so I saw it as a clique. And in one sense it was. But what I failed to understand, it was a small group that had bonded together because they'd been through hell backwards. I mean, they had been through the fire together, and it caused them to bond together. And in reality, I had to do almost no pastoral ministry with that group because somebody got sick, boy, they'd just zero in on them, praying for them, feeding them, doing whatever. I mean, they're taking care of each other. That was a small group that was functioning. Where I failed, I saw it only as a clique. I failed to set them in motion of reproducing themselves, raising up another generation. And so the foolish mistake I made was when you turn 30, you're no longer a part of the youth choir. You have to go into the adult choir. Well, each one, guess what happened? On their 30th birthday, they went and sat down and stopped doing anything. That was my fault. I mishandled that. And if I could do it again, I would put them in some kind of a program, start discipling. I'd start assigning some other young people to them that disciple them and train them and multiply. That's what you've got to do. So be careful, because every small group has a tendency to become a clique.
Sure.
Everyone does, every family. So you've got to teach them evangelism, teach them multiplication, teach them how to disciple others, and to share and let them know you're never going to be fulfilled in yourself unless you can reproduce yourself. You're going to die one day unless you do the will of God and do it right. And if you do it right, I've got preachers all over the world is going to be preaching my sermons when I'm gone. And that's the way you've got to think. So when you do that, you're into reproduction.
Okay.
I hope I've at least I shot a shotgun at it, but at least I hope I hit the target.
I know Pastor has something to say. Howard.
Yeah, it's very much connected to what you were talking about, and you answered part of it, but I think I'll still start with my original question, because when we use the word clique, what happens, in my view, is when people get into a small group, if it's not noticed right up front, they begin to be comfortable with each other. Sure. And instead of actually being a clique, they accidentally put up walls. So should there be a time frame, if you're starting cell groups, that if they're not producing fairly quickly, that you go in and begin to pour back into the original vision, and because people are not in the church world I grew up in, and now pastor, there has been created ownership by some people with certain territories, and it's a big challenge. It is a huge challenge, and it's one of the biggest enemies of cell groups, as far as I'm concerned. Whether the pastor's afraid to get 10 people together because that may be another church next week, and or just allowing them, well, they like each other, they're doing fine over there, but we'll just start another one over here. How important is it to be on top of and to guard the vision of the cell group, that it remains a growing organism within the church?
This is the same principle we're talking about, and it's very important, because if that is not the purpose of the group, be fruitful and multiply. If that's not the purpose of it, some people would be better off just go on to heaven while they're still saved, because there's too many risks that they're going to be facing in the future. They're not taking anybody with them anyway. So why do they want to stay here and occupy more time? This world's not our home. But if your whole purpose in life is reaching out and reaching others, and I think that's one of the main things we've got to do as pastors, as spiritual leaders, is constantly be reminding them why you're here. What is your purpose? Our purpose is not to go to McDonald's one more time and get a Big Mac. Our purpose is to take somebody to heaven with us. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm failing as a Christian. So you have to do this continually. I don't think you can put a certain time on it, even though you should use time for evaluation. And if you're moving forward, I can live with little progress. I simply can't live with no progress. So if we're not progressing at all, we got to make some changes. But if they're growing slowly, well, I can live with that as long as they're moving toward multiplication.
I know these other guys probably, the follow-up question is, I have leaned heavily into small groups based on the motorcycle, just all these different things, which is not as, it's been a lot of fruit, especially from our motorcycle ministry. There's families added regularly for the man. But at the same time, if you were speaking to a pastor with a couple of hundred people or smaller, and they were wanting to start cell groups, what is the first move a guy like me would make?
The first move is you got to start educating your people and training them to even think in terms like that. Because for many of them, they've never been exposed to those kinds of thoughts. When it comes to the type of cells, I really believe that the groups like you're talking about, motorcycle groups or, dog catcher group, whatever, if you love cats, I think if you've got something you center around a common interest, they work better here in the United States. Now, in other cultures, I've seen others that work very well, but we don't have that many things that we can attract people with. So if you've got commonalities, something like that, I think it works better here in the U.S. if you can zero in on people's interest, if you got a leader in that area.
If I could interject and weave a thought kind of between your mistake and what Pastor Howard is asking.
Yeah.
We've been here 9 years this August as pastors, and we jumped on the get-go to do small groups. And in the course of our first 4 or 5 years, we've kind of tweaked a lot of things. Going with some mistakes, I put a time frame of when I wanted a cell group to multiply. And then learning from past mistakes. I think all of us and those of you watching online have probably been a part of a small group where the pastor mandated to grow it and to split the group. And the small group that he was talking about, our church leadership mandated when you got so big, you need to divide, cell multiplication. And I'll never forget being in the room, and there was about 30 of us meeting in a home, and they said, hey, we're going to be dividing, our group is too big, and it killed everyone. I mean, I remember sitting next to Laura and it was like letting the air out of a balloon, thinking, oh, we're not going to be together again, and half of our group's going to be gone, and who do we choose to stay with or go with? And it was very frustrating. And so I personally understand the agony of our church folks when we tell them, your group's too big, you now got to divide. And so because a majority of the people who are leading a small group have been a part of some other church's small group. So they already have a preconceived idea. Yeah. And they typically follow us pastors' theology, which is bigger the better. Until you get too big, then you got to divide. And then when you divide, half the church is going to hate me, and now they're going to split. And now you got another church next week because they're mad at you for making them lose what they love. Yeah. So I say all that to say that one of the structures that we've attempted to implement from the get-go of our small group is to find a couple that gets it, that you can teach small group principles, have them lead a Bible devotion, have them in leadership with you, let them help you plan the meal, help get information to the people. And then what we do in our home is any group that's 7 or more people, we divide that group in the home. So there's 10 people in a group. We'll have 3 families over here and 2.5 families over there. And that helper in the small group leads that small group. So there's a small group meeting in the living room and there's a small group meeting in the kitchen. And it's even smaller because now you take 12 people and you break it down to 2 groups of 6. But what we're doing is we are purposefully training the next leaders. And that group continually meet with that small group individual. So when we announce, hey, we're going to be dividing, everyone's already like, we've already been doing that. Yeah, we come together for group time, but we've been meeting in our small group. So that structure, in our 9 years, we've only done that twice. And so it hasn't been a time frame that we've been able to nail down, but it has been a philosophy that we've implemented from day one, that while us 15, 30, 12, 8 are meeting in this home, we're also going to break that group down even smaller because whether it be a year from now, 15 months from now, or 6 months from now, we are going to multiply into 2 more groups from this group. So that's been very key in our desire to multiply is start that from ground one. Don't wait till the group gets so big to multiply, because just like Dale said with a cell, they're constantly splitting. They're constantly growing. And so we have to implement that from day one. And like I said, we personally did based on about 7 people or more. Right. That way you've got 2 groups of 5 or 2 groups of 4. So that's just a little
What
thought.
he's describing there, though, that's in the DNA, the purpose of the cell or the small group. The purpose of it was be fruitful and multiply, and so it's planned into this. It takes place naturally.
Right.
It's not something you force. And we can learn so many things just by looking at the way that God created. You'll have a couple that, they break away from everybody else. They enter into a covenant we call marriage, and they have 3 children, very happy. And you see another one, they've only got, 2 children. And then there comes one that's got 6 kids, and but it's all natural. It's not something that's forced upon anybody. It's just a part of their process. And then we know as the children grow up, we know what's going to happen. They're going to leave home, and they're going to start their own immediate family, but they'll bring the babies back to visit. It's just a part of the process, and that's the way we have to think of it as small groups in the church.
I do not plan at all. I'm very intrigued and interested and moved by the Holy Spirit concerning the subject today. Is the reason I'm so full of questions, guys. And but I know that through COVID, I'm going to direct this to him for just a moment.
It's fine.
Based on what are you doing now? Arcade, do you want to say? You tell me later.
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, I'm really trying to hear God's voice through everything. I think all of us are, because every church organization out there is bombarding Facebook with the latest gadget for you to purchase and buy and do better at church programming. I'm asking myself the question, without throwing away the principles of God, can we do church better?
Right.
I don't know about you, but COVID for me was extremely good.
Sure.
Because of the hard work of our staff, like Pastor John and his wife and everyone here, the last 4 years of being online, on the web, giving via the web, our church didn't miss a beat. In fact, we grew families. We were able to give more to missions, the ministry that Living Faith, feeding pastors. We were able to give $1,000 towards that, more so than we've ever been able to do a single offering. We increased giving to missionaries at that time. So it becomes the question of, without ever meeting in a building, we were able to do more kingdom ministry than we did during that time meeting in a building. So that's sobering thought.
Yeah.
Now, my personality, I run from pendulum swing to pendulum swing, so I'm thinking, well, we can do this all the time then, because I work my tail off all week long, and then on Sunday I come and work even harder. During COVID, I got to work my tail off all week long and then be at home and enjoy church with my family. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's a struggle to really not do what I want to do, but to hear what God wants to do. And one of the things that I feel like for Journey Church, we are making these strategies to help meet people that either, one, have bad theology, or two, are not comfortable with coming back to a building.
Sure.
And what I mean by bad theology is, I'm sure all of us have some individuals who have said, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian, I can watch online. And the pushback to that is we want to cram Hebrews 10:25 down their throat. Don't forsake gathering together, as some are in the habit of doing. Don't do that. And yes, that's true, but if COVID has taught us anything, it's that we can still gather together through a camera lens in their home. And that's a paradigm shift for pastors. You know, like Dale has said, we love to get a crowd in the building.
Sure.
But I've got to grow comfortable with the understanding there's going to be people that will never come to this building. And will I continue to count them as part of Journey Church? And for me, that answer is yes. So we are running ahead of, hopefully, the curve to meet people online and to do a better job connecting them online. Because if you're going to stay home and do church, then what that means is you still allow me to be your pastor, which means I'm still going to speak truth to you. I'm still going to help you grow, but I'm also got to bring correction to you as well. And, you start posting stuff on Facebook that isn't godly, you allow me to speak into your life to say, man, knock that off. That's not how Jesus would act. And you financially give to the church. You can't sit on the gift that God's given you. And maybe some of those watching online have the gift to connect with others online. So we're in a season where we're really trying to evaluate the online culture, number one. And then number two, and I don't want to give too much out of the bag, so we'll save it for another day. But we're also looking strategically at growing our leadership through small groups because I don't know what the next phase is and next wave that our culture is going to hit, but I do believe we're going to see some things in the next 6 months to 3 years that are going to shake the foundations of how we've done church over the last 500 years. And so we have to get ready. Just like we were ready for COVID via online, this next phase, and again, I'm not talking doom and gloom. This is exciting. I'm passionate about this. I'm excited, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're hearing God's voice and all that. So I hope that answers your question, Pastor. There's a lot in my spirit that I don't think I can share right now, because it is, Dale has taught me years ago, if you're one step ahead, you're a leader. If you're 2 steps ahead, you're a visionary. If you're 3 steps ahead, you're a martyr. So I don't want to get killed on some of these radical ideas that I think God is giving me. I love my people too much, and I'm so grateful. So, but the steps we're taking now is to build us and to prepare us for the next 3 years.
Sure, because our calling did not change with COVID. I have the same calling, same anointing. How we do church definitely changed, but in my world, it's not a panic because the calling did not change. Right. So I think we pastors need to lean into that, and just, I know we're running out of time, but to say thank you for the way you have done online, because I'm not jealous. It's a call to do better, because you guys do it as good as anyone, and I applaud that. Amen.
Yeah, I think, when you said what can we do during this season, I think, identify leaders, equip them during this time, and then, people seem to follow the natural flow of things. So like right now, people are thinking summer. If and when kids go back to school, let's say it's after Labor Day, then I've found those are a good time to launch things, small groups and things, because their mind is already shifting to something more disciplined, more organization, versus trying to do something in the middle of the summer when everybody's taking vacations and all they're thinking about is going to the lake. So it's a good time to pour into leaders, but I wouldn't try to start groups right now if it was me personally.
Right.
So,
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. Well, pastors, thank you all so much for your input and wisdom. And Dale, thank you so much for this subject. It's like I said, a subject that all of us can learn and glean from, and I hope that you've heard something that challenges your thinking. It's been well said, a friend is a friend who will challenge the way you think.
That's right.
And so I think all of us have been challenged on some area when it comes to small groups, how to do them, how to get plugged in, and the purpose of them. I want to leave you with this one last thought. I mentioned earlier about our church was able to give financially to the Living Faith to help give pastors in other countries food and resources. To date, over $43,000 has been given. And I just want to explain what that means. That has happened not because of a few large donors. That's happened because of many people committing to $10, $20, $50, $100 to help feed people. And I want to invite you, if you would, visit daleyerton.com, DALEYERTON.com, and consider and pray about becoming a monthly giver to the Living Faith. Every dollar you give helps us further God's glory. Again, thank you for being with us here. Pastors, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next month on City Changers.
Thank you.